I invite you to stand as you're able for our gospel. Word of life, Jesus Christ, all glory to you. Word of life, Jesus Christ, all praise to you. Our hearts burn within us while you open to us the scriptures. Word of life, Jesus Christ, all glory to you. Word of life, Jesus Christ, all praise to you. The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came and, when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make such a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and went and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know about this and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. Dear friends, grace to you, peace, comfort, and healing today, and to all the world around us from the one who heals, Jesus. Amen. Did you all have a sense, perhaps, of déjà vu as we read the beginning of our gospel today? You should have. Once again, Jesus could be found in and near the sea, going from one side to the other side. And once again, the crowds followed him in tow. The sea and the crowds have shadowed Mark's account of Christ's work for the last several chapters. Our reading is the beginning of chapter 5. Jesus has spent a lot of times near the sea and with the crowds. Mark recounted many events in just 4 chapters that took place around the sea, amid the comings and goings of the crowds. And the crowds continued to grow, and they pressed in, we hear, on Jesus. They clamored to him for his attention. So far, we've heard in Mark's gospel that Jesus departed with his disciples to the sea, kind of to seek refuge from these crowds. The crowds were following him because they were hearing about all that he was doing, especially healings and miracles. He escaped to a boat because of the crowds. In this reading so far from Mark's gospel, unclean spirits have hailed Jesus as the Son of God. But Jesus ordered those spirits to secrecy. 5 times so far we hear of the crowds in just 5 chapters of Mark. Their presence, the presence of the chaotic sea, the series of miracles that Jesus was doing, his teaching about the kingdom, and his sporadic commands to secrecy, they all press the issue of faith and our response to this Jesus character. We join the disciples. We join them in asking, as the chaotic seas were calmed at Jesus' command, who then is this? Who is this? Mark wants to escalate our sense of awe. And today's story brings the whole to its climax in a way that prepares us for what comes next and highlights the very next story in this gospel, Jesus' rejection in his own hometown. But first, in a marvelous narrative that we just heard, Mark does what Mark is so good at doing. He brings 2 miracle stories together. He combines them. You've heard this before, as we've read in previous weeks, Mark putting one story within another story. Today we hear of a woman healed and a young girl raised from the dead. They are played out together, kind of in a point-counterpoint conversation with one another. Telling the stories together does more than just magnify the impact of each of these stories. It really forces us. It forces the issue of healing or salvation and faith. Both of these stories force that issue together. Once Jesus arrived among the crowds alongside the sea, without a transition, we hear that the leader of the synagogue came too. Jairus fell at Jesus' feet and begged him repeatedly for the life of his dear little daughter. And without even saying a word, Jesus went with him. The large crowd continued to press on him. We, of course, have every reason to expect a successful outcome. The prayer is right, the purpose is worthy, the prospect of healing and life is secured. We've seen Jesus act already in this story, so we have every reason to expect a successful outcome. And then there's this woman. She just shows up. She not only interrupted Jesus, but interrupted the story and our expectations. We get to hear her medical history, how she spent everything she had to get well, what she thought of her situation, and how she hoped to touch the clothes of Jesus. If only I but touch his clothes, I will be made well, she thought. And when she closed in on Jesus, she did just that. and she was made well. Jesus felt it, and he asked kind of accusingly, "Who touched me?" Jesus didn't know. He didn't know who did, but the woman certainly did. And in fear and trembling, she fell down before Jesus and confessed the truth about what had happened. She came to Jesus and had hoped for healing, but her hopes were far too small. The fear and the illness that defined her life still gripped her. That's how it is with the good news of the gospel. When Jesus spoke, she got more than she ever could have imagined. No longer was she just a woman in the story. Jesus claimed her as a daughter. Not just any daughter, but one whose faith had made her well, whose faith had saved her. Words and a promise were added by the Lord to the new reality in her life. She received a benediction from Jesus that invited her to leave in peace. And then, almost as an afterthought, she received confirmation that she had indeed been healed of her disease. She got so much more than she thought she might get. But our story isn't over. In mid-sentence, while Jesus was still mouthing his benediction to the woman's faith, people arrived on the scene to say that the leader's daughter had died. In that same instant, one person's hopes soared and another's fell to pieces. One was claimed as a daughter, and another's daughter has been lost. The people put it so clearly to Jesus. "Why even trouble the teacher any further?" they said. "What hope is left?" The one who stilled the storm rattled them up again by saying, "Do not fear, only believe." Can't imagine what the people would make of that. A better translation from the Greek, and I owe this to my teacher who I used last week in the sermon, James Boyce, my Greek teacher. A better translation of "do not fear, only believe" would be "stop being afraid" and "go on living by faith." Go on living by faith, but stop being afraid. Because if the command was "do not fear," then it was already far too late, right? That didn't address the reality of the crowd or the leader. The daughter was dead. They were very afraid. It doesn't really address our reality either as we read these stories and we hear, because so often we're already consumed by fear, and the prospect of faith can remain distant for us. That was the case for Jairus and the crowds. Much as they may have wanted to believe, they were gripped with fear. The word of Jesus, though, has power in this story, and it still has power for us. It has power to change our lives from fear to trust, like we must read happened to Jairus and to the crowds. The daughter was dead, yet the word of Jesus made real the prospect of life and salvation for her. From Jesus' word of promise, with this prospect of transformation from fear to faith as good as done, well, the rest of the story just fills in the details. We hold our breath with just a touch of delight as we follow the working out of what we already know to be the outcome. Working out what we already know. We smile as we hear about weeping and moaning, knowing the outcome and knowing what's going to happen. We can chuckle and wink knowingly at the misplaced laughter of the crowds who don't know what we know. Jesus took the little girl by the hand and gave her a command. Get up. A better translation again would be arise. Arise, Jesus said. He talked resurrection to this young girl. And since we know what's going to happen to him, to Jesus, we can hear that too as a prediction, a word of hope for his own future story. 2 daughters, though. 2 stories. 2 lives saved. And the people around and the disciples in the story ask, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? If that's the question that you're asking at the end of this story, then you're asking the right question. That's what Mark is getting at. You're asking the right question. It's what the crowds wondered. It's what the disciples wondered. And I'm pretty sure you already know the answer. So is Mark, by the way. We already know the answer. But that doesn't change the wonder of the story or the promise of transformation from fear to faith so that we can go on living, so that we can go on living by faith. Thanks be to God who gives us this faith through his word, his very living word for us. Amen.